What if the feminine wasn't a secret waiting to be unveiled, but a wild force before which we can only learn to dance? Nietzsche never approached woman as something obvious, but as an enigma, as an intensity that escapes any attempt at definition. The feminine, in his view, isn't a static essence, isn't a fixed social role, but vitality in its purest form, instinct that challenges logic and exposes the fragility of our certainties. When we try to explain it rationally, it has already changed faces, already reinvented itself, already become something else. Nietzsche saw in the feminine a creative and destructive power, capable of revealing both the beauty and cruelty of life. He provokes us to abandon the need to control and classify, inviting us to come into direct contact with the vital force that the feminine carries. What if this mystery were, in truth, an invitation to transform ourselves? Perhaps the eternal enigma of the feminine isn't about understanding it, but about letting ourselves be transformed by it. The feminine doesn't reveal itself through analysis, but through experience, through the courage to face what cannot be domesticated. It's a force that moves in shadows, that reinvents itself constantly, that never allows itself to be fully captured. When someone tries to define what woman is, they've already missed the target. For Nietzsche, the feminine shouldn't be seen as essence, but as event. It's an enigma precisely because it never surrenders completely, because it always guards a remainder, a shadow zone that logical mind cannot reach. And it's precisely there that its strength lies, in the impossibility of being reduced. The enigma of the feminine is like life itself, unpredictable, contradictory, beautiful and terrible at the same time. In everyday life, we can perceive how this manifests. A woman can be, in the same instant, tenderness and fury, softness and firmness, laughter and silence, not because she embodies fixed extremes, but because she moves between them with a naturalness that disconcerts. The feminine is a dance of opposites, continuous metamorphosis. Whoever tries to capture this essence in words, formulas or stereotypes only reveals their own inability to deal with what is alive. Nietzsche provoked his readers by affirming that life can only be endured when we don't try to domesticate it. The same applies to the feminine. It shouldn't be solved like an equation, but lived as experience, as intensity. Just as we cannot imprison the sea in a bottle, we cannot reduce the feminine to a set of rules. The unfathomable mystery of the feminine is what maintains its force, what makes it inexhaustible, what turns it into a source of creation and transformation. This perspective is uncomfortable for many, because it forces us to abandon the desire for control. The human mind yearns for answers, for certainties, for definitions. But Nietzsche reminds us that truly living is accepting instability, enduring the vertigo of what cannot be dominated. The feminine, in its deepest form, embodies this vertigo. It doesn't allow itself to be explained, but invites surrender. It's interesting to note how, in our daily life, we try to transform the feminine into roles: mother, wife, lover, daughter, muse. All these are merely fragments, attempts to reduce something that escapes. The feminine doesn't fit these labels. It crosses through all of them and surpasses them. By reducing woman to functions, we lose the dimension of her power as vital force. Nietzsche would say that the real danger isn't mystery, but our illusion that we can end it through simplistic explanations. Therefore, to understand what he calls the enigma of the feminine, we need to change our posture. It's not about seeking definitions, but opening space for experience. It's like looking at a starry night. We don't try to explain each point of light, but we let ourselves be touched by the immensity that surrounds us. The feminine, for Nietzsche, is this immensity, not an object of study, but an experience that transforms whoever contemplates it. This first contact with the enigma of the feminine forces us to recognize a limit. It's not about resolving, but coexisting. The feminine remains as horizon, always beyond what we can reach. And it's precisely this inexhaustible character that makes it fascinating. It reminds us that life isn't something we possess, but something before which we learn to move, like someone who dances with forces greater than themselves. Perhaps this is the initial lesson Nietzsche leaves us. The feminine isn't there to be explained, but to be experienced. Whoever dares face it directly discovers there are no formulas, but there's beauty and mystery. What remains is to open our eyes, open our skin, open our soul to this enigma that doesn't resolve itself, but teaches us to live with more intensity. For Nietzsche, life isn't sustained by reason, but by instinct. Reason, for him, is nothing more than a late tool, a creation of consciousness that tries to organize what is, at bottom, chaotic and vital. Whoever believes everything reduces to logic loses sight of what really moves existence. The feminine in this sense appears as radical manifestation of this instinctive force, as a way of being in the world that doesn't ask permission from reason to exist. When Nietzsche speaks about instinct, he doesn't treat it as something animal in opposition to human, but as what guarantees the power to live. Instinct knows before knowing. It acts without needing to justify. It feels without needing to translate. That's why the philosopher saw in woman a presence closer to life, precisely because for him she carried this visceral connection with primordial impulses. In everyday life, this appears in ways we don't always perceive. Think about how often a woman feels something is wrong before even having concrete proof, or how feminine intuition, frequently ridiculed, proves accurate in situations where reason falters. This power of instinct, far from being weakness, is a way of being in tune with life's deepest currents. Nietzsche saw in this not just a characteristic, but a transformative force. Of course, here opens controversial terrain. Many could say Nietzsche reduced woman to instinct, as if she weren't capable of thought or reason. But this reading is simplistic. What he did was recognize that life, at its base, isn't rational, and that whoever connects with this instinctive dimension carries a force that the overly rational don't comprehend. If woman was, in his view, closer to this power, this didn't diminish her, but placed her in contact with the root of existence. Instinct for Nietzsche is also will to power. Not power as blind domination, but as impulse of expansion, affirmation, growth. The feminine, connected to this flow, reveals itself as field of vitality that cannot be contained. There's something untamable in this. Whoever tries to control this force ends up crushed by it, because instinct always finds gaps to manifest itself. It doesn't allow itself to be completely domesticated. In real life, we see this when norms and social expectations try to imprison woman in rigid roles. Still, this instinctive force breaks barriers, creates paths, invents new ways of existing. Nietzsche would say the feminine doesn't accept living in cages, even when the cages are golden. It embodies the reminder that life isn't conformity, but constant creation. Looking at this power of instinct, we also perceive how it connects to what Nietzsche called the tragic of life. Instinct doesn't guarantee easy happiness, doesn't promise security. It plunges into risk, accepts pain, faces the unpredictable. Therefore, the feminine, when seen through this lens, is also dangerous, because it brings forth what cannot be controlled. But it's precisely in this danger that the intensity of existence lies. Nietzsche believed that whoever tries to eliminate instinct, whoever seeks to live only through reason, ends up becoming fragile, sick, resentful. Life demands this raw energy that instinct offers, and the feminine, in its connection with it, reminds us of this necessity. More than thinking about instinct, it's about learning to trust it, to let it guide in certain moments, to listen to what reason cannot translate. The power of feminine instinct, therefore, isn't just something biological or psychological. It's a metaphor for how we need to reconnect with life at its root. It's not about imitating woman, but learning from what she symbolizes in Nietzsche: the courage to live without needing to justify each step, the capacity to create paths where logic only sees walls, the disposition to trust in what pulses before even having a name. Thus, when speaking of the feminine as power of instinct, Nietzsche challenges us. He asks us, are we willing to abandon the illusion that we control everything? Are we prepared to dive into vital flow without guarantees? The feminine in this vision places us before life in its most intense form, beautiful, wild, and dangerous. And perhaps only by accepting this force can we truly learn to live more fully. Nietzsche never believed love was a place of peace. For him, love wasn't shelter, but battlefield. He saw love not as harmony between two beings, but as clash of forces, as struggle of wills that meet to dispute space, intensity, and dominion. The feminine in this context isn't merely object of love, but active force that transforms this encounter into something unpredictable and at the same time fascinating. Love, in Nietzsche, is directly linked to his idea of will to power. This means that when we love, we don't seek only affection or tenderness, but affirmation of our own force through the other. We love because we desire to expand ourselves, because we want to live life in its potency. But this desire inevitably enters conflict with the other's desire, who also wants to affirm themselves, also wants to expand their force. The result isn't fusion, but tension. The feminine embodies this tension like no one. It seduces, fascinates, disarms, but at the same time places the other before their own vulnerability. In everyday life, this reveals itself clearly. Whoever has lived a relationship knows that love oscillates between moments of absolute surrender and instants of silent dispute. Small gestures of seduction, power games, veiled disputes for attention, control or freedom are part of this dance. Nietzsche teaches us this isn't defect, but essence. Love isn't a path of tranquility, but an abyss that demands courage to be crossed. Seduction, in this scenario, isn't superficial trick. It's the art of power in movement. When someone seduces, they're not just conquering the other, but affirming their own force, showing their vitality, their capacity to move reality around them. The feminine for Nietzsche is master in this art, not because it manipulates vulgarly, but because it understands instinctively that love isn't about naive fusion, but about game of forces. And if we think well, there's nothing more human than this game. It involves us from first glances to most lasting relationships. Behind romance, behind promise of eternal union, there's always invisible struggle of who tries to affirm their singularity within encounter. The feminine, in this sense, reminds us that love isn't prison, but creative confrontation. Confrontation that can both destroy and elevate. Nietzsche also deeply distrusted the idea of love as idealization. To love isn't placing the other on pedestal, but facing their contradictions, their instincts, their shadows. Whoever idealizes too much ends up suffocating the very object of love, demanding from them purity that doesn't exist. The feminine, when observed with sincerity, doesn't allow itself to be idealized. It reveals its ambiguity, its beauty that also contains danger, its sweetness that can also wound. It's in this game of masks and revelations that true amorous intensity occurs. When speaking of love and seduction, Nietzsche touches a wound that there are no guarantees. To love is expose oneself to risk, enter territory of clashing forces, dance on edge of abyss. That's why so many people prefer transforming love into contract, into security, into routine. But for Nietzsche, this type of domesticated love is form of cowardice, attempt to deny life in its rawness. True love is dangerous because it forces us to face our vulnerability before the other. The feminine, in this sense, is living reminder of this danger. It doesn't surrender completely, doesn't allow itself to be reduced to function or role. It remains enigmatic, and it's precisely this that makes it seductive. Mystery isn't defect but force. It keeps us moving, prevents us from falling into boredom, forces us to continue playing life's game. Perhaps Nietzsche's greatest provocation is this: love doesn't exist to give us peace, but to awaken us. It isn't calm, but storm. It isn't answer, but question that never exhausts itself. And if the feminine is largely who conducts this game, it's not because it brings only beauty, but because it carries capacity to launch us to limit of what we endure. To love, therefore, is accepting war disguised as embrace. It's recognizing that seduction isn't deception, but expression of life. It's understanding that will to power manifests not only in external battles, but also in most intimate encounters. Nietzsche invites us to abandon illusions that love is harmony and face, directly, fact that loving is always risking oneself in fire of power and desire. If there's something that fascinated Nietzsche, it was life's capacity to always restart. He saw in existence a force that never exhausts itself, that even amid destruction finds ways to flourish. This power to generate the new, to transform what seemed definitive into beginning, is deeply linked to Enigma of the feminine. The feminine, in his vision, isn't just receptacle, but active force, creator, capable of reinventing forms of life, not only in biological sense of maternity, but as symbol of spiritual and cultural renewal. The concept of eternal return helps understand this connection. For Nietzsche, living fully means accepting the idea that everything repeats infinitely, that each instant returns eternally. This idea isn't condemnation, but challenge, being capable of saying yes to life as it is, in all its cycles. The feminine, by embodying capacity to generate and recreate, is living metaphor of this eternal return. It reminds us that nothing is truly dead, that there's always space for rebirth, for new beginning. In everyday life, we see this creative power in simple but profound situations. A woman who, facing loss, finds strength to reinvent her life. A mother who, beyond giving birth, teaches her children to think freely. An artist who transforms her pain into work, making beauty born where there was only darkness. The feminine is this capacity to recreate worlds from ruins, to transform suffering into movement, to make of end a door to the new. Nietzsche distrusted traditions that imprison woman only in fixed roles, because he knew this mutilated her creative power. The true power of feminine isn't in conforming to already defined functions, but in breaking with them, bringing to world something that didn't yet exist. Creating the new is always gesture of courage, and the feminine for Nietzsche symbolizes this primordial audacity. The feminine also carries power of danger. To create is to destroy, in sense that all novelty demands breaking with something already established. New life is born from death of what no longer serves. Therefore, the feminine isn't only sweet creator, but also destructive force that opens space for what comes. This double aspect, generating and annihilating, makes Enigma even deeper. The feminine doesn't offer only security, but vertigo, because it creates without guarantees, creates diving into unknown. This vision is provocative because it challenges our habits. We're accustomed to thinking creation as something linear, ordered, planned. But Nietzsche saw in feminine reminder that creation is also chaos, is also risk, is also surrender to unpredictable. It's like fertile earth. It welcomes seed, but also demands seed die so something new can emerge. The feminine is thus metaphor of life itself, fecund but also cruel generator of beauty, but never without pain. If we look at our own lives, we perceive how this power manifests. How many times, facing failure or disappointment, weren't we forced to reinvent ourselves? How many times wasn't it necessary to let old versions of ourselves die so something new could be born? The feminine, as symbolic force, teaches us precisely this, that living is recreating oneself, is not clinging to old, is opening space for new even when it hurts. Nietzsche believed only whoever opens themselves to feminine as creation can, in fact, affirm life in all its intensity. To deny this force is deny life itself, is seek security in ready formulas, is try to imprison flow of existence. But accepting enigma of feminine is accepting eternal movement of birth, death, and rebirth. Thus, the feminine becomes not just human aspect but cosmic principle. It reminds us that world isn't static but pulsating in constant transformation. It invites us to abandon desire for control and launch ourselves into risk of creation. Living, after all, is creating oneself each day, is generating new forms of being, is allowing new to emerge even when it frightens us. Perhaps that's why Nietzsche saw in feminine not just mystery, but promise. Promise that life doesn't exhaust itself, that there will always be paths still unexplored, that we can always be born anew, even if from ashes. And whoever understands this dimension doesn't fear change, but learns to dance with it. Nietzsche never believed in naked truth. For him, absolute truth was dangerous invention, created to give security to minds that cannot endure life's instability. What exists, in fact, are perspectives, interpretations, games of force. In this scenario, feminine appears as symbol of profound wisdom, that of mask, appearance, seduction, not as vulgar lie, but as way to reveal what reasons rigidity doesn't see. The feminine for Nietzsche dominates territory of appearances not because it deceives, but because it understands that living is always playing with surfaces, with images, with gestures that never say everything. Seduction, in this sense, isn't falseness, but art of expressing life's complexity through veils. Feminine mask doesn't just hide, it also reveals, because it exposes limit of what alien gaze can endure. In everyday life, this truth shows itself in simple situations. An enigmatic look that says more than 1,000 words, strategic silence that carries greater force than any explanation, gesture of vanity that isn't just aesthetic, but affirmation of presence, power, vitality. The feminine, in its relation with appearance, reminds us there's no transparent purity in life. Everything is interpretation, everything is surface, everything is game. Nietzsche valued mask because he knew life in its essence is theater. Each person wears roles, assumes characters, stages their existence before others. Whoever believes they live without masks, according to him, merely wears most naive of all, mask of purity. The feminine, on contrary, masterfully assumes this game, and therefore becomes mirror of human condition itself. This dimension provokes discomfort because many still believe truth is hidden behind appearances. Nietzsche inverts this logic. Perhaps truth is precisely in appearance, in game of surfaces. Life has no stable foundation, no fixed essence to be discovered. What exists is movement, transformation, multiplicity. The feminine, with its art of creating images, seducing with masks, dancing between contraries, embodies this radical vision. But it's important to understand, this mask isn't cheap deception. It's not about pretending something one isn't, but understanding that identity itself is made of layers. A woman who shows herself differently isn't lying. She's revealing her plurality, her capacity to be multiple. Mask isn't betrayal of truth, but expression that truth is always fragmented, unstable, unfinished. Let's think of concrete examples. A woman can be passionate lover one night, protective mother next day, rigorous professional at work, fun friend in conversation circle. Where is the real woman? Nietzsche would say, in all these masks, and in none at same time. Truth isn't hidden essence, but constant movement between roles. The feminine teaches us that living is accepting multiplicity, without needing to reduce oneself to single definition. This game of appearances is also game of power. Whoever masters art of mask doesn't let themselves be trapped by others' gaze, but conducts this gaze, directs it, molds it. Seduction, in this sense, isn't superficial trick, but manifestation of will to power. The feminine, in dealing with masks and appearances, shows that living demands not only courage, but also aesthetic intelligence, knowing how to present oneself, knowing when to reveal, knowing when to be silent. Nietzsche saw in this form of tragic wisdom, because living without illusions doesn't mean living without masks, but accepting that masks are part of life. Whoever demands absolute truth becomes naive, vulnerable, incapable of dealing with flow of existence. The feminine, in contrast, reveals maturity. It plays with appearances without getting lost in them, because it knows there's no ultimate foundation to be discovered. This enigma places us before provocation. What if living well isn't seeking final truth, but learning to use our masks consciously? What if life is less about revealing essence and more about creating forms, staging possibilities, inventing versions of oneself? The feminine, with its art of appearance, shows that truth isn't beyond masks, but in skill of living among them. Thus, by valuing masks, Nietzsche doesn't diminish feminine, but elevates it as master of life. It shows us that instead of fleeing appearances, we need to embrace them, learn from them, recognize in them form of freedom. What remains isn't tearing off masks seeking definitive face, but learning to dance with them, like someone who knows life is game, and only whoever accepts game can create something new. Throughout our journey, we've seen that Nietzsche didn't seek in feminine final definition, but enigma, a mystery that doesn't resolve itself, but forces us to live more intensely. The feminine in his vision is instinctive power, is field of amorous battles, is creative force, is game of masks. And all this converges to greater point, feminine as enigma that liberates. It liberates because it tears us from illusion that life could be captured by rational formulas. It liberates because it reminds us that living is always risking oneself, diving into forces we don't control, abandoning security to enter vertigo. The feminine, as symbolic force, shows us that existence is unstable, mutable, contradictory, and precisely there lies its beauty. Mystery isn't something to be eliminated, but what keeps life pulsing. In everyday life, this freedom appears in subtle gestures. A woman who refuses being defined by rigid social roles, amorous relationship that doesn't bind itself to possession contracts, but lives intensity of moment. Creative act that's born from risk, not certainty. The feminine reminds us it's only possible to live fully when we accept enigma, when we stop seeking absolute answers and learn to dance with uncertain. Nietzsche, speaking of eternal return, challenges us to say yes to life in all its forms. The feminine is metaphor of this yes because it never surrenders completely, never closes itself in definition, never allows definitive rest. It keeps us moving, forces us to restart, invites us to experiment life as continuous creation. It's this openness that liberates us. Not promise of security, but infinite possibility of transformation. Of course, this freedom has price. It demands courage. It's easier to believe in fixed truths, immutable roles, certainties that calm. But feminine, in its enigmatic dimension, shows us real life never fits these prisons. It tears us from comfort, exposes us to risk, launches us to unknown. And it's precisely this discomfort that generates growth, that awakens, that transforms. Nietzsche knew majority prefers living anesthetized, protected by illusions. Therefore, his philosophy isn't for everyone. He spoke to those who have courage to endure weight of life without masks of purity. The feminine, by remaining unfathomable, becomes mirror of this challenge. It doesn't offer us answers, but invites us to endure endless questions. Whoever accepts this invitation approaches rare freedom, freedom to live without needing to possess, without needing to control, without needing to understand everything. This vision makes us rethink our own relation with mystery. How many times do we try to suffocate unknown, transform into answer what should remain as question? How many times do we seek to imprison other in labels, when true encounter happens precisely in what escapes? Enigma of Feminine teaches us life gains intensity when we don't try to explain it entirely, but when we accept its multiplicity. At bottom, feminine in Nietzsche isn't just reflection about woman, but about existence itself. It's symbol of everything that resists reason's control, everything that remains alive and uncontrollable. Therefore, understanding it, or better, experiencing its force, is also learning to live differently. It's letting oneself be crossed by intensity of instinct, by vertigo of love, by courage of creation, by game of appearances. Thus, Enigma of Feminine becomes key of liberation, not because it gives us answers, but because it teaches us to live without them. Not because it resolves our fears, but because it shows us it's possible to walk even with them. The feminine, eternal enigma invites us to transform life into dance, into game, into endless creation. Perhaps this is Nietzsche's final provocation. What if life is only bearable when we stop seeking ultimate meaning and learn to live in mystery? The feminine reminds us of this daily, and therefore continues being force that disturbs, fascinates, and transforms. What remains is accepting invitation, opening eyes, and dancing with enigma that never resolves itself, but liberates us. We've reached end of this journey, but not end of mystery. The feminine in Nietzsche was never definition, but force. Instinct that breaks certainties, love that's disguised war, creation born from ashes, mask that reveals more than it hides. What we've learned is that life, like feminine, doesn't allow itself to be imprisoned by fixed truths. It demands courage to live risk, endure vertigo, and say yes to mystery. Nietzsche invites us to abandon need to control and embrace uncertainty as source of power. The feminine, eternal enigma liberates us precisely because it never surrenders completely. It forces us to remain open, attentive, alive. Perhaps true wisdom lies in accepting there are no final answers, but only infinite dance of living. And now, I ask you, what belief about love, feminine or life, has most imprisoned you until today, and that you're ready to let die? Leave your answer in comments, and also tell where you're watching from. If this reflection touched you, like the video, subscribe to channel and share this journey. Thank you so much for being part of this community that seeks to think deeper, live more intensely, and transform through philosophy.